So we're in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, right at the end tonight. We are going to meet tonight and then next week, and then we're going to take a break for the summer months. So I wasn't quite sure when we were going to do that, but having thought through it today, I've decided that we'll end next Tuesday. It's my brother's birthday, so I'll do something in remembrance of him. He's still alive, so why would I do it in remembrance of him? There's going to be silliness tonight, apparently. So let's begin by reading God's Word. Maybe that'll straighten my mind out a little bit. So here we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and the first words are quite appropriate. Verse 16, so we do not lose heart. We may lose our minds, but not our hearts. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. For we know that the things that are seen, we need to get a light right above me here so I can read better. For we know, for we look not at the things that are seen, but on the things that are not seen or unseen. For the things that are seen are temporal, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Now that's the first part of the section, and I'm going to stop there because obviously I can't even read very well tonight. But Paul had earlier talked about the nature of the New Covenant ministry, and he's talked about the paradox of the New Covenant ministry, especially in the previous statement about this contrast between the weakness of the messenger and the glory of the message, as he celebrated the great fact that we have this treasure in clay pots, so the surpassing greatness of the power may be of God and not ourselves. But underlying all that he is writing about, and began back in chapter 1, is the reality that he is distressed about these Corinthians. He is overwhelmed by concern for them, and he began in chapter 1 by talking about God who comforts us in all our trials and all of our difficulties and our challenges, and many of them were coming from the Corinthians, and the battle of discouragement was very much a battle that Paul was concerned about. And in chapter 7, when we get there, he'll talk about the fact that God who comforts the depressed, the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. And so there's this sense of discouragement or the potential for discouragement. I was reading a couple of blogs today, a couple of days ago, and they were just ones that I read, but this time happened to talk about pastors, and they were in an interesting kind of framework. It was advice to young pastors coming out and warning them about things that they were going to wrestle with. And discouragement was one of the things they talked about. And then turned to the next one, it came up, and it was about a guy who said, I've often envied, he was talking about pastoral ministry, I've often envied guys who go to business on a building site. And they work on the building site, and at the end of the day, they can look at it and say, I accomplished that, and they can see it visibly. And then he said, the problem with ministry, it isn't like that. You never get much evident chance of seeing what is happening immediately. You're trusting God's at work, but you don't immediately see it. And sometimes you can, but most often you can't. And even when people respond in a positive way, as we'll see in a parable we're going to look at in a couple of weeks, what looks like it may be a response turns out that no, it gets choked off. And so Paul is dealing with that. So as we begin in verse 16, he says, we do not lose heart. And that's the way he began verse 1 of chapter 4. At the same time, he says, since we have this ministry from God, we do not lose heart. But the challenge is that he felt like at times he was losing heart. And he's just talked about all of the difficulties he's had in ministry and all of the challenges as he's serving the Lord. Just to go back and look through, because this is very much the background of it. Beginning in verse 8, we're afflicted in every way, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but we're not driven to despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying in our body the dying of Jesus, so the life of Jesus may be manifested in our bodies. So now he wants to come back and he wants to say the paradox of the Christian life, that God's power is often shown through weakness in the messengers. And now he wants to shift, though. He said, but when you look at it from the sense of eternity, then everything begins to look different. And so in these verses, that's the contrast that's very much in his mind. We do not lose heart. And the reason we don't lose heart is we recognize, though our outer self, our outer person, is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. And there's this contrast between the physical reality of his life and the eternal work that God is doing with him. So when he's talking about his outer self, he's talking about in his humanity, in his physical body, and as he suffers all of these various things, and as the realities of what it means to be human, but also to be human serving Christ in difficult context comes in. He knows what it says, means to say our outer self is wasting away. Now, when we're in our 20s, we don't notice that nearly as much. When you get aged beyond wanting to talk about the numbers, you begin to feel that. But Paul's not talking because of age. He's talking primarily because of ministry and the impact of pouring your life out and serving God in these particular ways. But if our outer man is decaying, our inner man, our inner self, is being renewed day by day. And when he talks about the inner man, he's talking about what he's going to talk about in chapter 5, verse 17, when he says, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creature. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. And it's talking about the new inner life that God is producing within us. So in Ephesians chapter 3, when he prays, he'll talk about that you might be strengthened with might in the inner man. The inner man is the real Gary Inrig, the eternal Gary Inrig, the Gary Inrig that will exist on the other side of death, who I am eternally because of what God has done in my life. And so he's talking about that in terms of this ongoing renewal. So the decay that we have externally is being more than compensated for by inner renewal. There is a sense in which, and we battle the realities of physical aging and all of these other things, but there is a reality that in Christ there is the possibility that we're not just getting older, but we really can be getting better, to be getting wiser. It's one of the saddest things in life sometimes, and we had to sit through last Thursday a graduation ceremony, which was wonderfully nice to see our high school senior in Phoenix get graduated and go on to the next part of his life. But you listen to all the platitudes that are given in the speeches about how we're going to go and we're going to change the world and we're going to do all of these kind of things and all of the accrued wisdom that you have when you're 18 years of age. And then, these are some of the best years of our life and they're never going to get better. And you begin to think, that's the way our society works, but it ought not to be the way the gospel is working within us. And that there is within us this growing reality of what God is at work doing in our lives. And we're being transformed, as he says in chapter 3 and verse 18, from one degree of glory to the next. And it ought to be that as we grow older, there's more evidence of the reality and fragrance and presence of Christ in our lives. So that's the first of these three contrasts. that he's having, the contrast between the outer man and the inner man. Then the second contrast is in verse 17. For this light momentary affliction is working for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. So the second is between the afflictions of life and the glory that awaits us. But we need to think about what Paul calls this present light affliction, because he's not talking about an easy experience. And last week I read you the passage in chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, or 2 weeks ago, when he goes on talking about the beatings he had, the imprisonments he had, the shipwrecks he endured, all of these kind of troubles and difficulties and challenges of experience. And so when he is saying here, our present light weight of affliction, he is not talking in comparison to others who have it harder. He's contrasting between the present reality and the eternal things that God has prepared for those who love him and know him. And what he is saying is the afflictions we have now will be compensated for us by the working of God in our lives. For the afflictions are working, and it's what's called a divine passive. Greek has a way of saying the passive in when it says the afflictions are working. What it really means is God is working in the afflictions. That this is in God's hand, this is in God's work, and God is working an eternal weight of glory which is beyond all comparison. Now, you've heard me probably mention this before. There's a kind of play on words that Paul is using, because the word in Hebrew for glory is the word that literally means weight and weightiness, heaviness. And so when he talks about an eternal weight of glory, he's almost kind of playing with words here. The idea of weight in the Old Testament and being related to glory is, my dad used to talk about somebody and he said, that's a person with substance. And he meant in contrast to somebody who was frothy. We don't tend to use that in quite the same way anymore, but that's the Old Testament sense. You had somebody who was important was somebody who was weighty, not heavy in terms of putting on too much pounds, but there was a weight, there was a, I guess the word we would use that would become closest is there was a gravitas, and gravitas comes from, related to the word gravity. And he's saying the light affliction, which in human terms is not light, is working for us a weight of glory. One commentator uses the expression, and I've used it on the outline, a tonnage of glory, just to put up the kind of comparison he's making. A tonnage of glory that is incomparable in connection with the affliction that we are having. And you think here of 2 Corinthians, of Romans chapter 8, verse 18, when Paul says, I reckon, good King James English, I reckon that the sufferings of this present age aren't worthy to be compared to the glory that is going to be revealed in us. And I don't know about you, but I receive enormous encouragement when I read that. Because it's often my privilege and it's my responsibility to sit down and talk to somebody, and they are going through really challenging times. It may be because of a family situation of one kind or another. It may be because they've got an illness that is just extremely difficult. It may be that they were born with a certain disability in a particular way. It may be because their ministry has been hard and difficult and challenging in some particular way. They have been faithful to the Lord, And they've just, kept coming up against it. It may be because they're experiencing persecution in some particular way. But what Paul wants us to understand here is that our present light affliction, that we often don't call light, and some of us exaggerate the weightiness of it. When we're deeply, sometimes wronged, I think of Christian wives who have been horribly mistreated by unbelieving husbands or sometimes professing Christian husbands, and they are serving Christ and they're being faithful in that. And Paul comes along and says here, you can't compare present suffering to the glory that's awaiting you, that the Lord will put it right. And that's not kind of what Karl Marx called the opiate of the people of religion, as if that is living in a fairy tale world and it's just trying to make you accept your present suffering. It's the promise of God that the afflictions that we have are producing a weight of glory beyond all comparison. And so when I whimper and whine at different times that this isn't fair, or I shouldn't be treated like this, or all of these other kinds of things, there's a time in which the Lord just sort of wants to take me aside and say, you're not home yet. I love the story, and some of you have heard me tell it, but it's told of a missionary couple who'd been out in Africa, and they were finally coming home after long years of service. And they had been there and had suffering after suffering in Africa. And at the turn of the century, at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, it was a horrific kind of experience that they had to go through to live. And they happened to get on the same boat when they were coming back as Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt retired from the presidency, if you remember, and then he went on a big game hunt in Africa, and he was lionized. That might be not the right word there, but he was acclaimed, and the newspapers followed him everywhere and sent back all of these reports. And when he was coming back, because he was a very popular president, people were surprised when he hadn't been elected in his first term, so he could have chosen another term and he chose not to. And so when he came back, there were boats out in the harbor to meet him, and they came in. When they came in, there was thousands that were there, and this missionary couple came, and there was nobody to meet them. And they were very discouraged, and then they stayed in a hotel that night, and there was all this hustle and bustle, and the next day there was a ticker tape parade through New York of Teddy Roosevelt as an ex-president coming back, and all of this acclaim. And they had to take a bus to get to where they were going to take a train down to their home. And they said, her husband says, I just don't think this is fair. We've served the Lord all these times, and Teddy Roosevelt's gone on a hunting trip, and we come back and there's nobody to meet us. He comes home, and everybody's crazy about what he's done. And his wife, as wives have the way of doing so often, spoke in words of wisdom and said to him, but honey, we're not home yet. And what she was thinking of was, as you think of Stephen, and that picture of the Lord standing to receive Stephen when he's come into heaven, and the promise of well done, good and faithful servant. And this verse brings me back to that hope and that kind of orientation. Our present light weight of affliction is working for us. God is using it to work for us a degree of glory far beyond all comparison. Well, you hear me inveigle against the prosperity gospel and all of these kind of things. And if you've been following the news, you know that one of the leading preachers is saying God's told him, yes, he has to have a fourth jet for $55 million, and Jesus has told him you should send money so he can have his jet. And I just want to lie on the ground and gag at that kind of blasphemous use of God for promoting his luxury lifestyle. And it's so contrary to Peter here, saying, I'm suffering all of this but my eyes are on something bigger than the present and on what is going on. Then he has the third comparison, and the third comparison in verse 18 is, we don't look at the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. The things that are seen are temporal. And this is the Paul who can write, I know how to be in plenty and I know how to be abased. I know how to be in all of these circumstances. I can do all of these things through Christ who strengthens me. And here he is in his weakness, preaching the gospel. He's going to end his life as a prisoner, and not long after he writes this, he's going to find himself a prisoner in Jerusalem and then off to Rome. And in the midst of it all, we're not looking at the things that are seen. The present world and all of the things that are so attractive and so enticing us, but the things that are unseen. And by that, he doesn't mean so much the visible and the invisible. He means the present and the eternal. Because when he says things that are seen are temporary, talking about this world, but the things that are unseen now, because we'll see them. It's not that they're going to be invisible forever. We're going to see the glories of heaven, the glories of the new heavens, glories of the new earth, the things that God has prepared for those who love him. And he's saying, that's where I want you to understand about what New Covenant ministry is all about. And this is such a radically un-Western way of viewing life, where the accumulation of things and the accumulation of possessions and the appearances of the present outweigh almost everything else. And so Paul is trying to give us this new vision. There is a coming glory, and we need to live not moaning about current circumstances, but anticipating God's provision and God's purpose for us. So you can tell these are verses, I guess, that have some meaning to me in a personal way in my own life, although I don't know anything about what Paul is talking about of light afflictions. My afflictions are really light, but I get annoyed by them. The point is, we need to have a new covenant view of life and not this world view of life. So let me just stop there and see what insights you have into this, things that the Lord maybe challenges you with as you read these verses, or some questions or things that we should talk about a little bit more.
I just wanted to clarify, when he talks about our outer self is wasting away, is he referring specifically to him and people in ministry, or is he speaking of all of us in general?
I'm sorry, the first part I missed, Nikki.
When Paul talks about our outer self wasting away, is he referring to himself and his ministry partners and people who are in ministry, or all of us?
Yeah, I think what he's talking about here is true of every believer. Our outer self wastes away. You'll feel that more as life goes on, of what that means. It's getting to be a habit, isn't it, that it rings. Actually, the fellow who phoned, if you remember, on Sunday morning, was wanting to have a counseling session with me. That I had that afternoon, but it wasn't a trick call, just a badly timed call at that time. But no, I think he's talking about, he certainly has himself and his ministry partners, but I think he's wanting to say, because this is what he says elsewhere in Romans chapter 8, that he says that it's in a passage in Romans chapter 8, he's just said, as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the children of God. God has not given us a spirit of bondage again to fear, but the spirit of adoption by which we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, sons of God. Spirit bears witness. us, that we are sons of God. And then he goes on to say, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may reign together with him. And then he says, I reckon that the sufferings of this present age, not worthy to be compared to the glory that is going to be revealed in us. For the whole creation stands on tiptoe, waiting the revealing of the sons of God, or the daughters of God. So when he's talking that way, he's talking about us as Christians, not just some select group of leaders or people who are, quote, in ministry. This whole process of outer decaying but inner renewing ought to be for all of us.
The inner renewing, we're renewed by, the renewing of our mind. Is that, I assume that would be one of the ways that we're renewed day by day.
I think if I was to put it in the largest picture here, I think he's talking about being renewed in the likeness of Christ. I think he's talking about godliness of character, about increasing conformity to the character of Christ. So that we are, as we grow older, we should also be growing more in the fruit of the Spirit, more in the evidence of the working of God in our lives. That's not automatic. There's no way that's automatic. I told you the story before that as a university student, I remember a man named Stacy Woods, who was really important for the ministry of students, InterVarsity in Canada. He founded it in Canada, he founded it in the United States, and then went to Europe and founded the international InterVarsity movement. But he's preaching in my home church, and he said, I pray every day that God would keep me from becoming a cranky old man. And I remember sitting there as a 18 or 19-year-old thinking, wow, getting older doesn't mean you get better. Unless you're allowing the Lord to be renewing you in that kind of way. And so I think that's primarily it's what he's talked about in chapter 3, verse 18, when he says that we all with unveiled face, beholding as a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed from one degree of glory to another, one degree of Christ-likeness to another, even as by the Lord, the Spirit. So I think that's the renewing that he's talking about. So. Okay then. Okay, back here, Richard. What's really good if you do this is to try and spread them out and give Richard as much exercise as...
And I need it. Is this verse teaching that there's some kind of correlation between how much affliction an individual Christian endures and the glory that they partake of in eternity, and how maybe I guess I'd like a little clarification about how our present afflictions or troubles are achieving for us glory. What does that mean? We know that our salvation and our future state of glorification was achieved by Christ and what he suffered, not by what we suffer. Can you comment on that?
Well, I doubt that there's a mathematical correspondence, that you have this much affliction, so you have this. But I do think that there is a sense in the New Testament that there are rewards for those who faithfully serve the Lord, and there are degrees of rewards and degrees of opportunity and privilege. And so I think that there is a sense in which there is some connection, and I'm quite willing to leave it to the Lord to figure that out. But it is clearly true. I mean, I remember Billy Graham saying on more than one occasion that I fully expect there'll be all kinds of people who get far greater rewards than I do, because I've had a lot of them here in this life, and they've served the Lord faithfully. in ways that I haven't, at a cost that I have never experienced. And I think what he was trying to say, there are missionaries who've gone and buried themselves in some part of the world and seen no immediate fruit, but the reality of their devotion to Christ and their love for Christ and their willingness to do it, that's a far harder. When I would go and do pastors' conferences and I would speak to people and they'd be in small towns and they've been faithfully there and they're not seeing very many results, but they're doing it and they're staying at it. Where my opportunities for ministry have put me in most places where there was opportunity for growth and there was evident blessing. And I just recognized at the point of time that in all fairness, God isn't going to grade by the numbers we see of great churches in America. It's going to be on an area that looks at my faithfulness in the responsibilities that he's given to me. And it's a little bit like the parable of the talents, and that we're faithful in what God does us, he'll reward in that way. I'm not sure I'm answering your question very well. But I do think that there are rewards in heaven, so that I am going to be in heaven, and even though that work is Christ doing it through me, there are crowns that I receive, crown of life and so forth. Keep coming if you're...
So does that imply that what was achieved for us on the cross is like a kind of say there's a baseline of salvation, but then rewards can be merited?
Well, we know that rewards are going to be there. I mean, that's what the Lord says. He talks about the fact that in 1 Peter chapter 5, when he talked to the elders, he said that there is therefore a crown of life is laid up. Paul will say, I've run the race, I fought the good fight. Therefore there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord will give to all those who love his appearing. There's parables that talk about the fact that people are given different responsibilities and opportunities that serve in the kingdom. Now we know ultimately that that's what the Lord does through us. But 1 John, on the other hand, at the end in verse 28 of chapter 2 of 1 John, the Lord will say, live in such a way that you will not shrink in shame from him at his coming. So there is some recognition of our service, our life in obedience and direction to him. It is ultimately all of grace, but there is a recognition of work done. So we hear him say, well done, good and faithful servant. Keep coming.
Okay. No. Okay.
This is a complete shift of emphasis, but it's related to verse 18. And it just made me think of something in Hebrews where it says the things which, we look at all the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And I'm not even sure if I have a question or just an observation or what this is, but it just made me think of Hebrews 11, I think it's 3, where it says, by faith we understand that the worlds were prepared not from things that are visible, but not from the things that are seen were not made from things that are visible. And I just thought that's another contrast between the unseen eternal and the
You get it
seen.
even further down in that chapter if you think about it, because it says they looked for a city whose builder and maker
that's
was
true.
God. And the essence of faith was they looked beyond. And he'll say of Moses that if he lived for this world, he would have had reason to stay in Egypt. But he left Egypt knowing that it was the will of God for him. So the whole point of much of what's there in the first part of Hebrews is the idea that it is the essence of faith to act on the promises of God that are, by their very nature, unseen. And even when they're seen, Abraham went out not knowing where he was going. He didn't,
Interesting. So, and in a sense, the things that we see, which are made by that which is not seen, are gifted to us by God. I mean, we have to see the seen, even though it's temporary, as a gift from him, because it was from the I'm not even sure I'm making sense. It's just an interesting...
Yeah, well, he's not disparaging the world any more than he's disparaging our present bodies when we get to this next section. They are a gift of God, but they are only a kind of anticipation of something greater and better and more enduring and lasting. Because this world is not intended to be permanent.
It's interesting how often that seen and unseen are juxtaposed, and it's not just in one book. And we see that we're in a temporary state, but we're also eternal. It's just interesting to me, and I can't quite explain why it's so interesting, but...
So.
Yeah.
Okay, well then let's look at this, because this carries on. It's the same thing. He's trying to give them this perspective of it's more than the present world. And if it was only in this present world, as he says in another passage in 1 Corinthians 15, which obviously ties up, if only in this world we have hope, we're the most to be pitied, because this is not a world that ultimately can satisfy that hope. So now he talks on another level about what this eternal glory is going to look like and what our inner man is going to be dealing with. So, we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our earthly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we're still in this tent we groan, being unburdened. Not that we would be unclothed, or that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who's prepared us for this very thing is God, who's given us the Spirit as a guarantee. Now, that's a fascinating passage, and it has all kinds of little twists in it. And one of the things that Paul does is he shifts images. He begins by talking about tents and homes, and then he begins to talk about clothing and being naked. And then he comes back to tents and homes, and he'll go on in verses 6 to 8 about talking about being home and being away. So it gets a little complicated, and he flows these images together. But I just want to notice three things on this passage, and you'll notice in our outline. First of all, he wants to say our fundamental conviction is that we have an eternal home, in contrast to the present. And in this next statement, I just want to isolate three things, and there's several things to notice. First of all, in terms of the outline, we live our lives in earthly tents. And so he's describing our physical bodies. And those earthly tents, as happens to tents, will be taken down to move. Now, this is Paul's life. He was a tent maker or a leather worker. So tents were part of what he knew and he lived in. Now, people in the Old Testament lived in tents in a way that New Testament people didn't, just because they lived in cities. So he's going into talking about people who are on the move, people who are on a pilgrimage. Perhaps he's thinking even of the Exodus in all of this that's behind him. But when he uses that image, we know that if the tent that is our earthly home, and he's talking about our physical body. So as you think about that image, I think there's several things that ought to be described. First of all, a tent, whatever else it is pretty common. You may go and look at luxury homes. You rarely look at luxury tents in quite the same way. I guess that there are always divisions you can make, and if you go camping sometime, you're going to get one that somebody else has that is pretty significant. But there's something ordinary about this, and this fits in what he said in chapter 4, verse 7. We have this treasure in what? Clay pots. So the body in one passage is a clay pot, and the other sense it is a tent, something that is passing in that particular way. And the other thing about tents is that they are temporary. They don't endure. No archaeologist digs up tents. They just don't last that long. They're temporary. They're subject to wear and tear. And in the final analysis, is true of our body. Now, behind this is the larger discussion that goes on well, let me leave that for just a minute. Now, the second thing he says, related to the tent, it is temporary, it's common, but if our tent is taken down, and he's talking about the fact that the tent is temporary. If it's destroyed, or even if it's just taken down and you're moving on to the next location. And he's talking about death. If physical death occurs, and it is the taking down of a tent. Now, he says if, because it's very clear that Paul believed at a significant part of his being that his tent was going to be turned into a home when the Lord came. He didn't live his life thinking that a tent was his destiny, or that the tent was going to be destroyed. He expected the Lord to come at any time. But in this passage, he's talking about there's a possibility that we might die. And probably as more and more Christians died before the Lord came, Paul came to that recognition in his own life, and he'd gone through such experiences that it's a possibility that I will die, and that I may not see the Lord coming before I die. But that's not his ultimate point here. It's obviously not the possibility of death, but it's the replacement that God intends for that. So, but by the way, and for some of you, this is an important distinction. If our earthly tent is taken down, we have a home from God, eternal in the heavens. We have a tent. We aren't a tent. Now, for some of you who come from a certain perspective, the body and the self are the same. But Paul is not saying that we are the tent. That is, the body is all that we are. It's saying we have a tent. He's already talked about it, the difference between the outer man and the inner man. And so the outer tent may be destroyed, but that's not the end of us. We have an eternal home. How does he say it specifically? We have a building from God, something permanent, eternal in the heavens. Now, at this point, what he's talking about is the resurrection body. And he is saying that God is going to replace our tent with a building that's his, and it's designed for eternity. And it's almost as if it's there already. So the resurrection body is the contrast of the present tent. Now, in this part of the passage, he's not going to be focusing on what happens between death, if our body is destroyed, and the coming of the Lord. He's going to talk about that in verses 6 to 8 when he gets there. So this is not talking about the intermediate state between those two, but the immediate state between those two. And so for some of us who didn't grow up with the idea that Adventism teaches that the self and the body are one in an inextricable way, that there is no soul, there is only the body soul of the person. So when the body dies, the person has ceased to exist. And what Adventism ultimately believes in is not resurrection nearly so much as recreation of the individual. But Paul is not talking in those terms whatsoever. But he is saying that we have a body from God, a resurrection body that God has prepared for us. Now, something else I wanted to say here. So just, it is created by God, it is eternal nature, it's designed for heaven, and this is really what he had talked about in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and he's not going back into that all over again, but you can see how closely the words that he's using here pick up what he had said in that chapter when he says in verse 53, this perishable body must put on the imperishable, this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then it shall come to pass, the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? Now, we need to understand part of this stands against everything that the Greeks basically believed, given from Plato. For Greeks, the idea that you would get rid of your body, they believed in a dualism. A dualism was enormously strong between the body and the spirit the body was the prison house of the soul, and what you wanted to do was to be free of the body so you could go into the presence of God. Modern materialistic Western thought is we are just bodies, and when our brain stops working, we end. And as Stephen Hawking made the statement before he died, he's changed his mind now, that all I am is like an old computer, and when I die, my computer will stop working, and there is no future for broken computers. They're finished and done. So in Greek society, the body was something to get rid of. In our society, the body is everything, except we're going through this strange shift in our culture in the last 20 years. So that my body is different from my mind in such a significant way that I can be one thing in my mind and I can be other thing in my body. Every cell in my body, every DNA thing can say, you are a woman. But if my mind says you're a man, my mind trumps the body in every particular way. I mean, it's a striking thing. So now gender is entirely a mental construct and a social construct, but not, it's a physical fact that there's difference of sex. It's in every cell in the body. But my identity, which comes from somewhere, trumps my body. Always hard to use trump now as a word, isn't it, in any kind of way? But are you seeing the kind of contradiction in that? If you believe your body is all you are and all you have, how can your mind totally contradict your body in terms of what your real identity is? So your mind is lying to your body at that particular, or one or the other. So we've got this strange thing in our culture now that the very thing that is designed to say, do whatever you want and all of your desires are good, also denigrates the body because it says the way you are made in terms of your body is irrelevant to who you really are. And how do you put that paradox together? How do you put that, it's at its bottom root nonsensical, and yet it's the prevailing wisdom of the world in which we live. That's probably about a confused way of expressing what is, I think, totally confusing as a reality as we can get. But the Bible has this conviction that while we are not our bodies are an intrinsic part of who we are. And Paul will, in this next verse, talk about being naked, because to be an inner man without a body is an unnatural kind of place to be. So even when we are in heaven, after we die, after our bodies have ceased to exist, until the resurrection, we're not put together the way God intended us to be. We are meant to be embodied souls, but that awaits the resurrection, because the body is important, but the body isn't defining. There's something more to us than that. Have I utterly confused you at this stage at what I'm trying to say? Maybe we just stop here and see if anything needs to be clarified out of the mud that I'm just trying to throw at you, or whatever, the muddy way I've expressed it.
So when Paul here uses the phrase heavenly dwelling, he's talking about a resurrection body. He's not talking about heaven.
No, he's talking about our bodies, because, and it becomes clear in the next part that he goes on, that we don't want to be unclothed, but we want to be clothed upon. And so the unclothing is death, as he shifts the imagery here. So no, he's talking about not our home is in heaven, but that we have a home where we're going to live in our bodies, in contrast to the tent.
Okay. This is a little more esoteric, maybe, but in terms of our present earthly life, where we have we're embodied, and we have a mind that appears to be in some kind of vital union with the brain, because we know that brain injuries can affect the ability to recall information, recognize people, that kind of thing, which are, we would think, functions of the mind. And also the other way around, we can have disorders like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, which seem to affect attributes that we would attribute to the soul, but they can affect the brain. So there seems to be this dependent union between our immaterial and material selves during this life. Do you think that's basically correct?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we are not mind and body as two separate containers. They are woven together in some significant way, and yet there's something deeper than our bodies. Mm-hmm. So that just some of those passages we automatically go to, the Lord can say to the dying thief, "You will be with me in paradise." So today, despite the attempt to say what the Lord says, I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise, as if that makes any sense at all. I say to you, you will be with me today in paradise, is what he's saying. So there is, when his body is dead, he is still there in some mysterious way, but even there, it's interesting, Jordan, I don't know how to explain it. I'm certainly not a neurologist, but even with people who, I remember my grandfather, my father-in-law, who had several strokes and couldn't remember Elizabeth's name, couldn't remember all kinds of things. And yet, when you began to quote scripture, he could somehow remember those things that were there. Or when Gene Watson was dying and Elizabeth would go and sit, and I did it once or twice, and I thought it was cruel and unusual punishment. We'd sing songs with her, and even though she didn't really have much, there was something deep in her that responded that was in a way even deeper than recognition of other things. I've sat there at those kind of times and sort of, in another discussion I had recently, just thought, that's really interesting how you can be so confused about some other things and yet touch something in her that goes down deep in a way that other things didn't. I can't unravel that part.
In this passage, Paul is talking about a believer.
Yes.
For the unbeliever, is there the same building from God that is awaiting them as well?
Well, it certainly isn't a resurrection body. We're not told anything of what, I mean, we're told that they are raised in the book of Revelation, chapter 20, and they stand before God and they're cast into judgment. So, I'm sorry, I remember an old joke about a guy who was hearing somebody preaching, and there would be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, and the guy yelled, "I've lost all my teeth," and the preacher yelled back, "Teeth will be provided." So I don't know what that means about the body being provided for judgment, but it will be conscious punishment. So.
So when on the Mount of Transfiguration, when Moses and Elijah were there with Jesus, we know they don't have their resurrection bodies yet, but they were able to see and they looked like people. Is that the model? Is that something we can look at and say, when we, before we get our resurrection body, when we go to be with the Lord, we'll be able to function in the same ways, or?
We can speculate all of those things, and it's one of those, the Lord has revealed things, but their secret things belong to Him. We're just simply not told. Actually, it's interesting in Revelation. The picture is, but Revelation is full of so many pictures, how do we know? And they're conveying, God is conveying it to us in language that we can understand and in pictures that relate to us. So heaven is a place with gold streets. Well, I doubt it, because gold, but it makes a point that the most precious things on earth are pavement in heaven. But it says that John sees the souls of those who've been martyred for Jesus under the throne. Well, he sees the people who've been martyred for Jesus, and he sees them as having some kind of form or appearance. So, but I think talking about Moses and Elijah on the Mount Transfiguration is really, that's such an exceptional event that I wouldn't want to use that as the basis for anything more than God loaned them some a capacity. Because how did they know that was, none of the disciples had seen either Moses or Elijah, so did they have big signs on them that said, this is Moses? I don't know. Somehow they were immediately recognizable, but...
Well, and then there's the text that says, whether we're absent from the body or present with the Lord, we make it our aim to please Him. So there's some way that we're able to do that.
Yeah. No, we will be conscious, functioning, recognizable people. So it says in 1 Thessalonians that the Lord will bring with Him those who've fallen asleep in Jesus. But the dead in Christ will rise first. So the same ones who are brought with Him are the dead who rise first. They are, what happens is their bodies are reunited with their intermediate existence. So we're going to come back to that next week. That's really next week's thing. So we'll get there. Let's look at verses 3 and 4 and just see what they're adding into this. So he is saying here, in this tent we groan. So this in some way goes back to what we had earlier at the end about the groaning and the suffering and the challenging of our bodies. Our outer person is decaying. The present world is a place of groaning. And that comes in a fallen world. Paul had used very similar language back in Romans chapter 8 when he said the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth until now, waiting the revealing of the children of God. And then it goes on to say, and not only that, we also groan within ourselves. So that there is a groaning of life because of the entrance of sin. And in this body we groan. And on one level that's a physical truth, but on another level it's an emotional truth. Because some of the things we groan most for have nothing as simple as a bad back. A broken marriage is a lot harder to deal with than a bad back. And broken relationships and sinfulness and rebellion and all of those kind of things. But he's saying that's what our present life is about. In this tent we groan, and one side is groaning and the other part is longing. There's a groaning of longing. And so we long to put on our heavenly dwelling. Now all of a sudden he's shifted, and talk about a mixed metaphor for those of you who are English teachers or students. We long to put on, which is clothing language, and it actually looks at what you put on as your outer garment. We long to put on our heavenly dwelling. So how do you put on a house? Well, he's using but again, the image is we have a tent, but we're not a tent. We lose our tent. We want to put on, we want our resurrection bodies. We want to be what God's created us to be. We want to enter into the liberty, as Paul will say in other places, the glorious liberty of the children of God. Not that we would be naked, unclothed. So we don't want to be unclothed. Nakedness is not what we desire. We'd like to go right from this life into the resurrection body. But in the next passage, he's going to say there is going to be this unclothed kind of condition. Not that we want to be unclothed, but we would be further clothed. That is, with the resurrection body, all that God has given to us, so what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. So our desire, our longing is to be off with this body, but be on with what God has planned and prepared for us in our resurrection body. So ultimately, death is entirely conquered, and it's the resurrection body that marks the completion of what God is doing. It's interesting that when Paul speaks about this, he says, we groan longing for our adoption, the redemption of our body. And it's interesting that our adoption in that place is the completion of what it means to be part of the family, and that is to have our resurrection bodies. So that sort of is the end of the process that he is describing here. So if I had my way, I suspect it's true of all of us here, if I had my way, I would love to go right from this body into the resurrection body when the Lord comes. I'd like to skip the unclothed part, the nakedness part. Come, Lord. But it wasn't that way for Paul, and for most of us it's not likely to be, although who knows when the Lord is going to come. And so he ends it by coming to this final statement that he who has prepared us, or he who is working this very thing, same word that he used, our present light affliction is working for us a weight of glory. He uses this same word here. You can't tell it by the English translation. He who has worked this very thing, who is bringing this about, is God, who's given us his Spirit as a guarantee. And the word is as a down payment, as he uses it in different ways. So the presence of the Spirit within us is the guarantee that God will complete what he has done. And that expression that he is the guarantee is found in 2 Corinthians 1:22 and in the book of Ephesians chapter 1, verse 13 and 14. He is the guarantee that what God has done, he will complete by taking us into the resurrection body and all the glory that awaits us. So Paul's whole point here is that we need to live with that perspective, that we are people who have a guaranteed future and a confidence, and to live our life now with that sense. It is so contrary, and you've heard me say this a million times, but I'll keep saying it. The only people whose best life is now is people who are headed for hell. And I'm not interested in being in that group of your best life now. My best life is forever, and I'm just sort of in the entrance point into that and all that God has prepared for us and his children. And when we've been there 10,000 years, we've only just begun, as the writer says. Okay, I haven't done justice to this passage, but maybe it'll give you some opportunity to come back and think about it and feed on it and imbibe it a little bit more. I'm not sure that there's anything else, Richard, that people want to ask or for. Okay, Colleen.
I just can't get past the ending of 4, that what is mortal will be swallowed up by life. Because in literature, there's a sort of universal symbolism of death being the great maw that swallows all of life, ultimately. And this is such a declaration that eternity and God and true life actually swallows up what we see. It's amazing.
And you remember, I read earlier 1 Corinthians 15, when he starts by saying that death is swallowed up by victory.
Yes.
So it's that same kind of picture here of the
Yeah.